When a waitress served breakfast to a silent veteran, she never expected anything in return, but that plate changed everything. 2 days later, a tank arrived in front of her diner, and that was just the beginning. What followed was a national tribute, a life-changing gift, and a movement born from a single act of kindness. Summer of 2014 had settled over the small town of Tuscarora, Pennsylvania, with a slow, heavy warmth that made everything feel suspended in time. The streets were quiet, the train station almost silent except for the occasional rumble of freight cars passing through. At the edge of the platform stood Union Stop, a modest diner built from old brick and steel. Its sign faded from years of sun and snow. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, frying oil, and sweet pastries. The hum of the refrigerator blended with the occasional clink of cutlery, creating a rhythm that was as familiar as it was forgettable. Behind the counter worked Sarah Hall, a woman in her early 40s with lines of fatigue etched around her eyes. Life had worn her down in places that didn't show under her denim apron or plain t-shirt. She had once studied art, had once dreamed of living in cities she only now saw in postcards. But dreams had given way to routines, and her world had narrowed to the worn floor tiles of the diner and the monthly calls from her son in college. Divorce, debt, and long shifts had dulled the sharpness of her younger self, but not her sense of decency. The morning unfolded without hurry. A pair of railroad workers sat at the window, boots dusty and shirts stained. An old man read the local paper, lips moving silently as he traced headlines with his finger. The coffee brewed steadily. Time crawled, like it always did in Tuscarora. Around noon, the door creaked open, allowing in a sliver of dry heat, and a man whose presence seemed to draw the light out of the room. He was older, maybe in his 70s, carrying a weathered backpack and moving with a kind of practiced effort, as if his joints resisted every motion. His eyes, sunken and shadowed, swept the room without interest. He chose the booth in the farthest corner, the one under the broken ceiling fan, and sat without removing his bag. Sarah noticed him immediately. There was something in the way he held himself, silent, reserved, yet strangely alert. His cap was frayed, but she caught the emblem stitched to its front, the eagle and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. No order came. He didn't open a menu. He just stared out the window, his hands resting on the table, still as stone. Without a word, Sarah plated a simple breakfast. Eggs over medium, 2 strips of bacon, toast with butter, and a cup of black coffee. She placed it gently before him and stepped away. He began to eat slowly, methodically, as if unfamiliar with the act or savoring something he hadn't tasted in years. His shoulders relaxed slightly with each bite. She watched from behind the counter, not out of curiosity, but out of instinct. Something told her this man had stories he wouldn't share, burdens he wouldn't voice. When he finished, he stood, nodded once in her direction without looking her in the eye, and walked toward the exit. On the table, he left a crumpled dollar bill and something else, an old, sun-bleached photograph. It showed a much younger version of himself in full uniform, smiling with fellow Marines in front of an American flag. The image was creased, edges torn, the kind of photo that lived in a wallet for decades. Sarah picked it up carefully and held it for a moment before placing it beneath the counter. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The diner returned to its stillness, but the air felt heavier now, as if it remembered him. So did she. Sarah kept the photograph beneath the counter, tucked between old receipts and a faded recipe card she hadn't used in years. It wasn't out of sentimentality or curiosity, but out of something quieter and harder to define. There was a gravity in that man's presence that had lingered after he left, like a scent that clung to fabric or a dream that refused to fade upon waking. The photograph stayed there, untouched, as if waiting for its own time to be remembered. She didn't tell anyone about him, not her coworkers, not the truckers who came in before dawn, not even her son when he called from college to talk about exams and rent. It wasn't a story she could explain, and it wasn't one she wanted to. The moment had felt complete on its own, as if the man had stepped in from a different world, taken a seat at her table, and then vanished again without needing to be understood. Still, the image of his eyes, hollow and heavy, lingered in her thoughts. In quiet moments, when the last customer left and the chairs were flipped onto the tables, she would glance toward the booth he had chosen. There was nothing special about it, just cracked leather and a loose screw in the leg, but it felt marked now, claimed by something intangible. She cleaned it like the others, but with a slower hand, as if wiping away more than crumbs. That night, a soft rain tapped against the diner's windows, streaking the glass and blurring the neon sign outside. Sarah sat alone at the counter with a mug of lukewarm coffee, staring out at the wet asphalt. A freight train rolled by in the distance, its headlights cutting across the darkness in a steady beam. The rhythm of the wheels on the track created a low, distant heartbeat that reminded her of nights long past, when her father used to come home in silence, drop his keys on the counter, and sit in the dark for hours. The veteran's silence had been the same kind. It wasn't empty. It was full of weight, of memories too jagged to speak aloud. She recognized it because she had grown up inside it, in a house where absence was louder than presence. Her father had never spoken of his war, only of the garden, the weather, the price of gas. But the weight of what he didn't say had settled into the walls like smoke. Now, years later, she saw that same quiet in a stranger's posture, in the way he avoided eye contact, in how he ate with both hands close to the plate, as if guarding something invisible. She hadn't needed his story to feel its truth. By the time she locked the door and turned out the lights, the man's visit had already become a part of the place. Not in a dramatic or haunting way, but in the subtle manner that certain things attach themselves to memory without asking. He hadn't thanked her, he hadn't needed to, and she hadn't expected anything. What she had done wasn't heroic or selfless. It had been simple, instinctive, a plate of food placed before a tired man. But something about it had stayed with her, as if she had stepped unknowingly into a moment that meant more than she realized. She didn't look for meaning in it. She didn't imagine there would be consequences or returns. All she knew was that something about the encounter had left a trace, and that trace, however small, was now hers to carry. 2 mornings later, the sky over Tuscarora hung low with a dull early haze. The sun had barely risen above the tree line, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. Sarah drove through town with one hand on the steering wheel and the other gripping a worn thermos of coffee. The roads were empty, just like every other morning, and the town stirred with its usual slow rhythm. She passed familiar storefronts still closed, windows dark and quiet. Everything felt normal until she turned onto Main Street. Her foot slammed the brake instinctively. In the middle of the road, crawling at an almost ceremonial pace, rolled a massive military tank. Its heavy treads clanked against the asphalt, and behind it followed another tank, equally imposing. Behind them came a convoy of military vehicles, matte green Humvees, armored trucks, black government SUVs, and open jeeps with small American flags fluttering from mounted poles. The sheer size and coordination of the procession made the narrow street feel impossibly small. People had already begun to pour out of buildings. Some stood on porches in disbelief. Others gathered on sidewalks, phones raised shakily in the air, recording what looked like the arrival of an occupying force. There were gasps, shouted questions, and a handful of children clinging to their parents. The air carried a tension that crackled just below the surface. No one knew what was happening, but everyone felt the weight of it. The tanks continued their slow crawl down Main Street, passing the pharmacy, the barber shop, and the post office before finally coming to a stop directly in front of Union Stop Cafe. The first tank halted with mechanical precision, its engine rumbling beneath the silence that had swept over the crowd. A few seconds passed, then the hatch atop the turret creaked open. From inside, a man rose, calmly, purposefully. It was the veteran, but he was no longer the quiet, weathered figure from the corner booth. He wore a full ceremonial dress uniform, its dark fabric pressed to perfection, its metals glinting in the pale morning light. His posture was straight, his face clean-shaven and steady. The transformation was so complete it almost defied belief. The crowd fell silent. The moment stretched out, heavy and breathless. He climbed down from the tank without assistance, moving with the ease of command. Behind him, the other vehicles began to unload. Soldiers stepped out in formation, officers in full regalia, staff in decorated attire. There were flags, military insignias, and photographers with press badges snapping photos in rapid bursts. This wasn't a show of force. It was a deliberate, orchestrated arrival. Sarah stepped out of her car, still clutching her thermos, her eyes fixed on the man she had served breakfast to just days earlier. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from disbelief. The street around her was filled with people, but the only movement she noticed was his. He turned toward the diner and raised his hand in a formal salute. No words were spoken, but something passed between them across that stretch of pavement. The town of Tuscarora stood still. In that instant, everything shifted. The ordinary street transformed into a stage for something larger than itself. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but no one dared speak too loudly. The tanks, the soldiers, the man in uniform, all of it pointed back to one quiet moment in a diner and a woman who had acted without hesitation or expectation. Now, that moment had returned to her, not in silence, but in ceremony. The town watched, trying to grasp the meaning. Sarah stood frozen, knowing instinctively that what was unfolding before her eyes was only the beginning. What followed felt less like a ceremony and more like a tribute woven from reverence and silence. Main Street had become a stage, and every movement seemed choreographed by something larger than the people who stood watching. The soldiers formed ranks with practiced precision. Flags were raised. A podium had been swiftly assembled just outside the diner, draped in a cloth bearing the insignia of the United States Armed Forces. Cameras were positioned, their lenses focused tightly on a single woman standing beside the veteran who had once been a stranger. General Lieutenant Thomas Garrison stood at the center of it all, commanding the space with a quiet authority. His name had once been spoken with awe in military circles, a decorated leader from wars overseas, long believed to have retired in silence. Yet now he stood not in Washington, nor at a base, but in Tuscarora, a town whose name had never made national news. And he told a story, not of battles or commands, but of his return, of the long days in hospital wards, of the slow walk through airports where no one noticed his presence, of the feeling that he had become invisible in the country he had once served. Until a plate of eggs and toast appeared in front of him, served without question by a woman who met his eyes without flinching. As he spoke, the crowd shifted from curiosity to stillness. The weight of his words hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Sarah stood beside him, her face pale, eyes wide but dry. She didn't fidget, she didn't smile. She simply listened, her hands at her sides, as the story of her unnoticed kindness unfolded into something unforgettable. When Garrison stepped aside, a uniformed officer approached with a scroll clutched in gloved hands. With solemn formality, the officer unrolled it and presented it to Sarah. The seal of the Department of Defense was embossed at the top, the gold lettering reflecting the morning light. It was a certificate of civic recognition, a rare honor given not to soldiers, but to civilians whose actions had upheld the values of service, dignity, and unity. She took it with careful fingers, her grip steady despite the moment's weight. Then came a second gesture. A representative from the National Veterans Foundation stepped forward with a sealed envelope. Inside it was a letter of thanks and a certified donation of $100,000 made in her name. The money was intended for the expansion of her cafe, the creation of a meal program for veterans in need, and to fund whatever community initiatives she deemed necessary. The gift wasn't just symbolic. It was practical, life-altering, and wholly unexpected. Moments later, soldiers led her toward one of the trucks that had arrived with the convoy. The back door was opened, revealing crates stacked high with supplies. Non-perishable food, industrial-grade kitchen equipment, even new tables and chairs, all cataloged and delivered by the Army's logistics team. The contents were labeled not for redistribution, but for use at Union Stop. The cafe was now designated as an official community support site for veterans passing through the region. More followed. Veterans approached one by one. Some were in uniform, others in plain clothes. Some came alone, others with family. They shook her hand, some hugging her quietly, some simply nodding with eyes too full for words. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about what she represented to them. She had seen someone who had gone unseen. She had reached across the silent space that so many veterans carried inside them. And now, one by one, they reached back. Local officials stood nearby, unsure of what to say or do. News crews filmed from a respectful distance. Children waved flags. What had started as a quiet gesture inside a diner had become a moment of national significance, playing out on a street where little ever changed. That morning, Union Stop Cafe was no longer just a place for coffee and eggs. It had become a monument, not of stone or bronze, but of human connection and gratitude too deep to be repaid. A month had passed, and the transformation of Union Stop Cafe was impossible to ignore. What once had been a quiet, aging diner with flickering lights and chipped paint had become something alive, something that pulsed with purpose. The outside still bore the same hand-painted sign, but the interior had changed in ways that went far beyond decor. The walls now carried the weight of memory, photos in black frames, uniforms folded in shadow boxes, medals and handwritten notes pinned to cork boards. A memorial corner had been created near the back booth, where the light from the window fell softly over a polished plaque. It listed names, some known in town, some not, of those who had served. Beneath the plaque sat a small flag folded neatly into a triangle. The tables had been rearranged to make room for more people. Long benches now lined the windows, and a second coffee station had been installed near the entrance. Veterans came at all hours, some in groups, others alone. They sat in quiet companionship, trading stories or simply being among those who understood silence. Volunteers from nearby counties began arriving on weekends to help cook, clean, and talk with anyone who needed a voice to hear them. Sarah had launched a new program called Plate of Gratitude. It was simple. Any veteran could eat for free, no questions asked. The town had rallied behind the idea. Donations poured in from churches, small businesses, even teenagers who hosted car washes and bake sales. Retired teachers knitted scarves, while local farmers donated eggs and produce. Children from the elementary school created handmade signs and thank you cards, which were hung across the ceiling like strings of paper prayers. But for all the noise and generosity, it was a quiet moment that stayed with Sarah the most. One evening near closing time, the cafe had emptied out. The sky outside was deepening to purple, and the lights cast a warm glow over the polished countertops. Sarah was wiping down the register when a man approached. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a faded green jacket. He didn't speak. He didn't linger. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a single military dog tag, and placed it gently on the counter in front of her. Then he turned and walked out. She stood there, frozen, her hand resting near the metal tag. The chain was worn, the edges smoothed by time. No explanation had been given, and none was needed. She understood. The next morning, a wooden box appeared near the memorial corner. Its lid bore a hand-carved inscription, "Memory Lives." Inside, people began to leave things. Photographs, letters, postcards from war zones, patches from uniforms, even small journals with only a few lines written inside. The box filled slowly, day by day, but never overflowed. It wasn't a collection, it was a sanctuary. News of the cafe traveled far beyond Tuscarora. Articles were written, interviews aired on local radio stations. But inside the cafe, nothing felt commercial or staged. The tone remained quiet, respectful, grounded in the same gesture that had started it all. Sarah never positioned herself at the center of it. She worked the same shifts, washed dishes, brought out plates of food, and asked how people were holding up. Her presence had not changed, but the world around her had begun to listen more closely. Union Stop became more than a diner. It became a place where the overlooked were seen, where the unheard were acknowledged, and where the forgotten were gently, persistently remembered. People came not just for meals, but for meaning. In that small town, on that familiar street, the silence that had once followed the returning soldier was finally broken, not by speeches or ceremonies, but by simple acts of human recognition. 1 year had passed since the day the tanks had rolled down Main Street and changed everything. The seasons had cycled through, bringing snowfall that settled softly on the rooftops, spring rains that soaked the sidewalks, and a summer that returned with its familiar heat. Life in Tuscarora had adjusted to the presence of the cafe's new role, and though the initial spectacle had faded from headlines, the impact remained, steady and rooted. One morning, in the middle of September, Sarah received a letter. The envelope was cream-colored, thick and formal, addressed in neat, cursive handwriting. It bore no official seal, no return address beyond a small house number in Virginia. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was delicate but firm. It was from the widow of General Thomas Garrison. The words were gentle, yet carried the weight of finality. Thomas had passed away 3 weeks prior, the result of heart failure. His health had been fragile for years, but he had held on, driven by the quiet mission he had set for himself. The letter explained that shortly before his passing, he had made one last request, a gift in his name to be delivered to the woman he had never forgotten. Along with the letter was a small set of keys. Attached was a metal tag inscribed with coordinates and a date. Sarah recognized the date immediately. It was the day she had served him breakfast. Later that afternoon, she walked out to the parking lot behind Union Stop. There, parked in silence under the early autumn sun, was a food truck. It was large, freshly painted in deep army green, with crisp white lettering on its side that read, "Heart of America, on Wheels." Below the title was an emblem shaped like a shield, flanked by wheaten wings. The truck gleamed as if it had been rolled off a production line only hours earlier. The windows were tinted, the tires new, the build clearly custom. Inside, the truck was fully outfitted, Industrial burners, refrigeration units, stainless steel surfaces, and storage compartments. Tucked in one cabinet was a clipboard containing permits and certifications, all valid, all registered in her name. Every detail had been arranged, thought through, completed. It was ready, not just to serve, but to move. The letter had been clear. This was his last wish, that her compassion, once rooted in a single act, could now travel. That kindness didn't need walls, that it could roll into towns struck by disaster, into neighborhoods overlooked by aid, into places where veterans still wandered unseen. Word of the gift spread quickly. Within days, a ceremony was arranged, quiet, respectful, and local. No national press, no politicians, just people. Hundreds gathered on the street in front of the cafe. Children held paper flags. A small orchestra from the high school tuned instruments beneath a canopy. Elders stood with hats clutched in their hands. Veterans lined the sidewalk, many in their old jackets, many with eyes already moist. Behind the crowd stood the same tank from a year ago, now unmoving, transformed into something between a sculpture and a monument. It had been painted over by dozens of hands, covered in signatures, messages, handprints, and quotes. It was no longer a weapon. It was a canvas of gratitude. Sarah stood in front of the food truck, the keys in her hand, her gaze calm and steady. She didn't speak. There were no speeches prepared, no microphones. The silence held its own power. With one deep breath, she climbed into the truck, turned the ignition, and let the engine come to life. From mounted speakers came the slow rise of a patriotic march, soft brass, rising strings. As she pulled forward, the crowd stepped aside, then erupted into applause. People waved, some saluted, others simply stood with their hands over their hearts. The truck rolled past them slowly, gracefully, carrying more than equipment. It carried a promise. Somewhere in the distance, wind moved through flags hanging from windows and storefronts. Leaves danced along the curb. Voices lowered to whispers as the truck turned the corner, and the town seemed to breathe in unison. One plate, one woman, one tank, and from it, a movement had begun.